There's an old truth about Texas that newcomers sometimes take a while to absorb. The land has a memory, and the people who worked it longest usually know exactly what they're talking about. Jack Morgan had been running cattle on his ranch just outside Prairie Ridge Estates for most of his life, and his family had been working that same pasture for generations before the subdivision ever broke ground nearby. The land wasn't sitting idle. It wasn't a scenic backdrop or an undeveloped opportunity, waiting for someone with a better idea. It was an active, producing cattle operation with longhorns, feeding schedules, and the rhythms of agricultural life that had been there long before the first HOA meeting was ever called to order. For years, the ranch and neighborhood coexisted without any serious friction. Ranchers and subdivisions share borders all across rural Texas, and it generally works fine as long as both sides maintain a basic respect for what the other is doing. That arrangement survived until the HOA discovered the concept of community bike paths. The proposal came with real enthusiasm behind it. Board members envisioned a paved trail connecting several sections of the neighborhood, winding through open countryside, offering residents scenic rides with wide views of surrounding landscape. It sounded like exactly the kind of amenity that makes a neighborhood feel like more than just a collection of houses. Brian Carter, the HOA representative spearheading the project, pitched it confidently at every planning meeting. This trail, he assured residents, would become the community's most beloved feature. People loved the idea. Social media was already writing the captions. When Jack reviewed the proposed route, he saw the problem immediately. The path ran directly through his active pasture. He went to the HOA and explained this clearly and calmly, not as a threat, but as a practical reality. His longhorns grazed throughout that pasture year-round. They moved through it during feeding and watering cycles. These were large animals operating on agricultural schedules that predated the neighborhood entirely. Putting a recreational bike trail through the middle of a working cattle operation wasn't a design quirk. It was a conflict waiting for a date on the calendar. Brian listened, thanked Jack for his input, and told him the project planners had considered everything. Construction began weeks later. Heavy equipment moved in. Survey markers went up. Workers paved a trail through pasture land, while Jack's cattle grazed within clear eye line of the whole operation. Jack raised the concerns again during the process, more than once, and received the same response each time. The project was moving forward, everything had been planned accordingly, and there was nothing to worry about. By summer, the bike path was complete, and the HOA threw a grand opening. Residents turned out, rode the trail, posted photos, and praised the beautiful scenery. The longhorns in the background of those photos probably seemed picturesque. They seemed considerably less picturesque a few days later, when cyclists started actually encountering them up close. Here's the thing about cattle that most suburban residents don't have occasion to learn. They're largely indifferent to humans. Jack's herd wasn't aggressive. They didn't charge bikes or block the trail on purpose. They grazed. They moved at their own pace, and they regarded the cyclists passing through their pasture with approximately the same level of concern they gave everything else, which is to say, almost none. But calm cattle and intimidating cattle are two different experiences depending on whether you've ever been within 20 feet of a 1,500-pound animal before. For residents who hadn't, even a completely unbothered longhorn standing near a fence line could produce a significant amount of adrenaline. The situation that ignited the full community response involved Jack's largest longhorn bull. The animal wasn't doing anything remarkable, grazing near the fence line, existing in the pasture he'd always occupied, completely uninterested in the bike trail or anyone on it. Several cyclists stopped, refused a ride past, and filed formal complaints with the HOA. Complaints started stacking up fast. Residents demanded action at board meetings. Some called for the cattle to be relocated away from the trail. Others wanted the ranch's operations adjusted to accommodate the new recreational path that had been built through the middle of them. Brian drove out to the ranch to handle the situation personally. He arrived frustrated and left with a much clearer understanding of Texas agricultural law than he'd had going in. Jack heard Brian out. The complaints, the community pressure, the demand that portions of the herd be moved away from the bike trail, and then responded with the patience of someone who had genuinely seen this coming. The cattle had been there first. Not metaphorically, not technically, literally first. The ranch had been operating for decades before the HOA existed, before the subdivision was plotted, before a single planning meeting had been called about any bike path. The Longhorns weren't violating anything. They weren't trespassing or creating a nuisance in any legal sense. They were occupying the same pasture they had always occupied, doing the same thing they had always done, on land that had always belonged to a working cattle operation. The problem wasn't the cows. The problem was that the trail had been built through their home, without adequately accounting for that fact. Brian took the issue to county officials, which turned out to be the most clarifying decision he'd made throughout this entire process. County inspectors reviewed zoning maps, agricultural records, and property documentation. Their findings weren't complicated. Jack's land held full legal protection as agricultural property. His cattle operation was compliant with every applicable regulation. The ranch wasn't the problem. The inspectors also noted something that landed harder than anything else in the review. During the planning process, the HOA had received multiple opportunities to evaluate alternate trail routes. Those concerns had been raised and then dismissed. The county wasn't sympathetic to the resulting situation being framed as Jack's responsibility to resolve. The HOA's leverage, which had seemed substantial when Brian drove out to the ranch, turned out to be essentially non-existent. You cannot compel a legally protected agricultural operation to restructure itself because a recreational trail was built through it without adequate planning. The law simply doesn't work that way, and no amount of community meeting pressure changes that. To the board's credit, once the legal reality became undeniable, they changed their approach entirely. Instead of continuing to pressure Jack, they invested in making the trail work within the environment it had been built through. Educational signage went up along the route, clear, informative guidance on how to safely navigate near livestock, what behaviors to avoid, how to read cattle body language. Additional fencing improvements were made to help manage cattle movement in ways that preserved normal ranch operations while reducing unexpected close encounters on the trail. The complaints tapered off. Then they stopped. Something else happened too, slower and more interesting. Residents who'd been riding the trail for the scenery started riding it for the experience. The specific, genuinely unusual experience of cycling through working Texas ranch land with longhorns in the field alongside them. It became, against all odds and with no marketing effort whatsoever, one of the things that made this trail different from every other paved suburban path in a 50-mile radius. Jack stood at the pasture fence one evening watching cyclists move along the trail at a comfortable distance while his cattle grazed under a wide Texas sunset. The ranch was running exactly as it always had. The trail was full. Both things were true at once, and the world hadn't ended. The lesson that Prairie Ridge estates absorbed through this, expensively, and with significantly more longhorn anxiety than anyone had budgeted for, is one that applies well beyond bike trails and cattle pastures. When someone who has worked a piece of land for decades tells you there's something important you need to understand about it before you build through it, that person is worth listening to. Not because they're trying to obstruct progress, but because they've paid attention long enough to know things that don't show up in any planning document. Jack Morgan had been saying exactly that from the beginning. Nobody listened. The Longhorns didn't have to say a word. Share this if you believe the people who've been somewhere longest usually know it best. Comment below. Where are you watching from? And has your HOA ever built something without thinking it through?